Central to the idea of the American dream lies an assumption that we all have an equal opportunity to generate the kind of wealth that brings meaning to the words life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, boldly penned in the Declaration of Independence. The American dream portends that with hard work, a person can own a home, start a business, and grow a nest egg for generations to draw upon. This belief, however, has been defied repeatedly by the United States government on decrees that denied wealth-building opportunities to Black Americans, Rashawn Ray and Andre M. Perry of the Brookings Institute. Whether you agree with the quote or not, that is the central question being raised throughout the country. Hello and welcome to Firsthand Segregation, Evanston Reparations, Lessons for the Movement. My name is Tim Russell, Vice President of Community Engagement and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for WTTW and WFMT, and I'm excited that you have joined us for this important conversation. In celebration of Juneteenth, today's conversation will explore local lessons from Evanston, the first municipality to enact and fund local reparations. Through the expertise and lived experiences of our panelists, we will hear about its reparations program, learnings, and what comes next for reparations for Black Evanstonians, and how they could be applied to the growing reparations movement across the country. WTTW's purpose is to enrich lives, engage communities, and inspire exploration. We are dedicated to extending the reach of our content into the diverse communities through events, community conversations, and educational and fun activities for kids and families. Building tangible connections to our audience is a mission-critical endeavor and continues to inspire us to be Chicago's window to the world. In February, we launched Firsthand Segregation, part of WTTW's award-winning multimedia, multi-year initiative, focusing on firsthand perspectives of people facing critical issues in Chicago. Throughout 2022, WTTW's Firsthand Segregation put a human face on the impact racial divisions have on individuals, the city, and our region through a documentary series, expert talks, text and visual journalism, in partnership with Southside Weekly, Invisible Institute, and our own WTTW newsroom, and community discussions and engagement and partnerships with Folded Map Project and the Metropolitan Planning Council. You can find this content on our website at wttw.com/firsthand. Now, before we get things going, I'd like to extend a very special thanks to the supporters of this project, who you can see listed here. Without the generous support of these donors, sponsors, and WTTW members, Firsthand would not have been possible. In addition, I would like to thank the Reparations Stakeholder Authority of Evanston and the Evanston Community Foundation for their partnership on today's event. Now, let's watch the trailer for Firsthand Segregation, followed by Saul Anderson, President and CEO of the Evanston Community Foundation, who will moderate today's conversation.
As you look at the city, you can almost tell by the skyline, right, where the opportunity is.
Segregation is deliberate when it's economically and racially driven.
We're pushed out of certain neighborhoods.
They pretty much let you know that they really don't want you here.
It was very Mexican, but no Black people.
How do we figure this out? How do we become more participatory?
Every neighborhood should reflect what our city is about. And it's about everybody, not just one race.
Hello, I'm Saul Anderson, President and CEO of the Evanston Community Foundation. I'd like to thank you all for joining us tonight. We're really excited about this conversation, really excited about the work that's going on in Evanston and across the country to push reparations for Black Americans. And I think this will be a wonderful conversation to learn, what's going on in our community and share some of those learnings with the rest of the world. So thank you all for being here. I'd like to introduce our panelists. First, I'd like to share that Morris Dino Robinson, the founder of Shorefront Legacy Center in Evanston, Illinois, is unable to join us tonight. He's traveling and had a delayed flight, and so is unable to make it, but he sends his regrets. But we still have a great panel, and we'll have a very lively discussion. So first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Cornell Brooks. Dr. Brooks is the Hauser Professor of the Practice of Nonprofit Organizations and Professor of the Practice of Public Leadership and Social Justice at the Harvard Kennedy School. He is also the director of the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice at the school's Center for Public Leadership and visiting professor of the practice of prophetic religion and public leadership at Harvard Divinity School. He's the former president and CEO of the NAACP, and a civil rights attorney and an ordained minister. Welcome, Dr. Brooks. Next, I'd like to introduce the Reverend Dr. Michael C.R. Nabors, senior pastor of the historic Second Baptist Church in Evanston, Illinois, one of the oldest African-American congregations on the North Shore. Reverend Dr. Nabors is also the president of the Evanston North Shore branch of the NAACP, a leader among Evanston's interfaith community, and a member of the steering committee for Evanston Reparations, the nation's first municipal reparations program. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce Robin Rue Simmons. Robin is the former alderwoman for Evanston's 5th Ward and was the driving force behind the Evanston City Council's passage of the nation's first tax-funded reparations program in 2019. Robin is also the founder and executive director of FirstRepair, a nonprofit working nationally to educate and equip leaders, stakeholders, and allies who are advancing local reparations policies that remedy historic and ongoing anti-Black practices. And I introduced Robin last because she is prominently featured in the documentary, The Big Payback, co-directed by Erica Alexander and Whitney Dow, which recently made its debut at the Tribeca Film Festival. So we're gonna play a few clips from that documentary tonight. But before we jump into our discussion, we'd like to show the trailer of this important film. So please roll the clip.
It should be cash payment.
I think what they're offering us is an insult.
How do you determine who's supposed to get it?
Yeah, I don't think reparations for something that happened 150 years ago is a good idea.
HR 40 is we're pushing very hard. There's been a lot of debate and discussion about the bill.
This is a proposal for reparations for the institution of slavery.
Yes.
The institution of slavery has never gone away.
Convict leasing,
the oppression of voting,
poll taxes, and racist GI bills.
HR 40 is in fact the response of the United States of America, long overdue.
I get this call from a dear friend. He said, man, you know, we got a bad sister in Evanston and she's pushing the reparations question strong.
Redress for the Black community, for the nation.
And so it was Alderman Simmons. You have become the visible face and the driving force of the Evanston Reparation Initiative.
Some mornings I wake up and I feel like, wow, I'm a part of history. This is special. And then it's intimidating at the same time, because what if you don't get it right?
The greatest hurdle is the political will to make it happen. And Alderman Simmons made it happen, gathering a lot of evidence, specifically implicating actions of the city.
This program, as it is incomplete.
I don't know why they would be given more status than any other group of people.
People have been extremely nasty to me.
You don't give them money and then tell them what they can do with it.
You cannot pay my grandfather back. He's dead. Give us what we're due.
I don't think it's gonna go too far or anywhere.
I'm still not prepared to join an insurrection. I just want you to understand who we are.
We in Evanston are leading the way to heal a nation.
We don't want a piece of freedom. We want the whole package, and that's reparations.
Great, we're gonna jump into our conversation, but before we do so, I'd like to remind or just let the audience know that you can submit questions via the chat function or the Q&A function, and those will be filtered in. We'll have some time at the end to bring in some audience questions. But first, to kick off our conversation today, I'd just like to start and ask our panelists a few questions. Starting with, it's really, what is reparations to you? I mean, as I've gotten deeper into this work, I've really realized that there's quite a wide range of what people consider to be reparations in our country. And just wanted to get a sense from all of our panelists what reparations means and what it looks like to you. So maybe we'll start in reverse order of our introductions, and we'll kick it to you first, Robin.
Thank you, Saul. I'm very happy to be here. In my learnings over the last few years, reparations is a complex process, and it takes on many forms, but it is a process that begins to repair harms that have been done. Specifically, as we're talking about the Black community, it is a process that will repair harms that have been done to slavery and its legacies. many forms of repair, and you can see the debate in the trailer on what opinions are there. But I consider the international standard of repair, full repair, to be a comprehensive approach, including compensation, restitution, and other forms, including satisfaction, like the Juneteenth holiday that we're celebrating for the first time as a federal holiday.
Reverend Nabors.
Good evening. So thank you very much. And thank you for asking me to come after Robin, who is all things reparations and has the perfect definition for it. Nobody can do any better than that. So I want to say that I agree with Robin with regard to her definition of reparations. And I would say that for me, the focus has always been on the sort of classic textbook definition of reparations, which is repair of damage that has been done as a result of the kind of reparations we're talking about. We're talking about damage that has been done with regard to racism and forms of discrimination that have been aimed specifically at African Americans. And if you look at it historically, obviously, you know, there are going to be different definitions of what that looks like and what it is. I know that Andrew Jackson, when he was a general and part of a group that looked for Black soldiers to participate in the Battle of New Orleans all the way back in the War of 1812. He promised those Black soldiers 160 acres and also $140. That's a form of reparations. That's all the way back in the 1840s. We know about Robert Sherman also making a promise of 40 acres and a mule. So historically, there have been all sorts of promises about what reparations is. And I think for today, there's not a real definition of what it's going to look like. It is going to cover the gamut, whether it is housing, whether it is cash payouts, whether it is a focus on education reform, economic development, all of the above. Whatever we can do to try to repair damage that has been done to Black people over the last 400 years, to me, is what reparations is all about.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Brooks.
Sure. First, let me just begin with a word of appreciation to all of you for putting together what is really an extraordinary conversation and a history-making conversation. Why? Because the citizens of Evanston have taken a bold leap and have, in fact, led the country. I want to commend my colleague, Robin Rue Simmons, for just doing such an extraordinary work. And for all of you for literally helping to move the country forward. But in asking the question, what is reparations? Like Robin, I invoke the classic definition to make whole. And like Pastor Nabors, I note that we have so many historical examples going not so much to Black people, but let us take note of the fact that we had white Washingtonian slave owners who asked for and sought reparations for the theft, as they saw it, of their property. That is to say, human beings. That is to say, chattel. That is to say, Black people. But I want to just note here and make a distinction that when it comes to reparations, there's an assumption that reparations with respect to Black people is aberrational, exceptional, unusual. But when we look at American history and look at reparations as reparatory compensation, that is to say, repairing for a harm, we see white farmers who, when they lose a crop, they are literally repaired at the hands of the federal government. When soldiers are injured in battle, they are repaired. There's an attempt to make them whole. When people are hurt on the job, they receive compensation, as in workman's compensation. When pensions are, when pension programs go awry, if they are insured, there's compensation. And so the point being here, and I think this point is being made well by this panel, is that reparations is a matter of making whole, but I want to simply make the distinction here that when it comes to making American citizens whole, this is regular and routine and commonplace with the exception of Black people.
Thank you so much for that. And Dr. Brooks, since you already started down this line of thinking, at least in my mind, I'd love to hear from you. what do you think people get wrong about the idea of reparations that causes this tension, right? That causes this tension, knowing that it's happened in amongst other communities. Why is it so difficult for Black folks in America?
Well, the wonderful thing about this panel is because of Robin Rue Simmons, I'm watching this wonderful clip which summarizes the arguments against reparations, I think beautifully, and in fact, in a very painful way. So we have no less a figure than the minority leader of the Senate, right? The senator from Kentucky, Mitch McConnell, who says with respect to reparations, it's for slavery that happened 150 plus years ago, right? But as the film clip notes, that when it comes to repairing the harm is ongoing. So think about it this way. When it comes to the harm that we're seeking to address and that we frequently get wrong, it's not a matter of a series of disconnected, disjointed tweets, right? But rather chapters that relate to one another in a long-running saga, a serial novel of our oppression. So in other words, the slavery and the slave codes gives rise to the Black codes and the convict leasing system. We go from 4 million people enslaved to 1 million people through the convict leasing system, at least that. And the convict leasing system doesn't end until the first week of World War II, right? And then after that, all we need to do is walk around Chicago, walk around Evanston, walk around Washington, D.C., or many of the cities and suburbs in this country, and we're walking in the midst of an era of mass incarceration. And so, and what the beautiful and powerful thing about Evanston is housing. I started off my career well before the NAACP as a fair housing attorney. And what you see in every community all across the country is segregated, depreciated, redline housing, which is literally an extension of the fact that Black people were freed from slavery with respect to the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, and literally made homeless as a race, okay? And so the main thing we get wrong is the notion that this is just about what happened before 1863 and 1865, as opposed to what has happened over decades, over a century and a half, and is yet happening now. And so what we're doing here and what you all have done here, commendably, is not recognize the distant past. You're repairing what is happening in the present.
Thank you so much. I think that's so poignant. And as Robin mentioned earlier, as we celebrated Juneteenth as a federal holiday for the first time, to think about how far we've come and how far we haven't come as a nation and as a people with all of those with those issues. I certainly appreciate that perspective. Robin, I'd love to hear from you. What do you think people get wrong about the idea of reparations?
Just really to add on to Professor Brooks' point is that we are not just looking at the crimes of slavery and those dated historical harms. We are looking at how those harms continue today, baked into our current public policy and practices and institutions, and how might we begin to at least repair that. And that was the thinking that I had in making the introduction in 2019. As a local leader, we have harms that are being enforced by the city of Evanston, have been enforced by the city of Evanston, that are within our purview to repair and beginning a process there. Also thinking that, there is a either or, either there is cash benefit or housing or the wealth gap or repatriation. Really, it is all of it for us to have repair as a people in this nation. And I think that that is one area of debate that really limits our argument when we should be widening and expanding our argument for Black people, even in eligibility as well. I believe that we are thinking too restrictive on repair, and we should be thinking more expansive, not even looking at just the city of Evanston, but the state of Illinois, Cook County, HR 40 passing, or some form of federal reparations, institutions doing their part, school systems and healthcare systems and so on. And so I think that what we're getting wrong is spending any time in debating what form or who is responsible, and inviting all institutional accomplices to the conversation on reparations and holding them accountable.
Much for that. Yes, and Reverend Nabors.
Thank you, Saul. I would certainly concur with Dr. Brooks and with Robin in sharing what they pointed out, especially the fact that there is, in my estimation, no singular panacea for remedying all of the wrong and all of the damage that has been done with regard to reparations. So often enough, for those who are under the impression that their perspective or their understanding of racism, which is a particular entity, whether it's cash payouts or the like, I think that it's important for them to know their opinion is valued and their perspective is important, but it's one opinion and it's one perspective. And when you think about the fact that there are about 40 million of us in the United States of America, you know, the fact that we're going to have various opinions is not unhealthy, but it's a healthy reality. So somehow we have to figure out how we can agree to disagree, and at the same time forge a path where we're moving together, locking arms, and recognizing that the advantages on the end of what we're doing are going to be so helpful for masses of people. I think one of the biggest challenges that we've had in Evanston, and that I think other initiatives are having as they begin to open up around the country, is getting folks in the community to come to some kind of consensus and being able to work together and to move forward. So I think if there's anything that we learned in Evanston, we learned that we may not have 100% consensus, but we do have the idea that moving forward with regard to reparations is going to be tremendously beneficial for our community. But at the same time, we have to understand we're pioneers in this effort as well. And so I want to just give kudos to Robin. I know I'm getting ahead of everything, Saul, but I have to say that I was at the Tribeca Film Festival last week. I did see a screening where Robin and Dina were brought forward on the stage afterwards. And it was unbelievable, the tremendous amount of support that they got from everybody who was in that movie theater that was almost sold out. So it was just great. We're doing something right. We're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. Just that where we are in Evanston is not the end of the conversation, but it's the beginning of the work. It really is. It's you know, you said when you go first, it's often, you know, I'm a first child. You know, my parents always say that they made the most mistakes with me and learned over time, right? This is really the first child of the movement where we're sitting right now is this work in Evanston. And I think the debate is really healthy. You know, and I appreciate just, you know, all of the perspectives on kind of what folks get wrong and or how the misconceptions. And, you know, I also think just fundamentally for folks, for non-Black people in America discussing, you know, reparations, I often feel like if you really look at the harms done to Black folks across our history in this country, I think a lot of people think that what Black people want in reparations is to harm back. And I think that that's also something that we run into in some of these conversations. And in fact, we're not asking to harm back, we're asking to be healed for the harms that were done to us. And I think if we can't get over even that foundational point, it's we've got a lot, I just say we have a lot of work to do to get over that foundational point for some folks. We certainly have a few more questions, but we have a couple more clips from the big payback that we'd like to roll. So I'd like to roll the in the air clip, if you would.
There's something in the air. The whole nation is watching this city, and indeed, perhaps over the world. And so it was Alderman Simmons who brings us here in many respects. You have become the visible face and the driving force of the Evanston Reparation Initiative. Why did you do this?
Evanston, we are leaders. And as I worked through my responsibilities as Fifth Ward Alderman, I saw how hard we were working. My colleagues on City Council, community organizations, residents, parents, we're working really hard to bring equity and inclusion, and we were not moving the needle. We still maintained a wealth disparity of $46,000 between Blacks and whites in Evanston. We continued a life expectancy gap of 13 years. Our Black homeownership rate is at its lowest point since the 1960s, and we needed to move our efforts beyond apology and ceremony, and we needed to bring action. It was time to do something as radical as the oppression and discrimination, as the impact from the Jim Crow law and the redlining, something as radical as reparations. There was nothing more to do.
Shake off some chills there. Powerful. So we're going to get into talking a little bit about the work specific, some specific topics around Evanston's reparations program. I do want for folks before we jump in to make one quick distinction for everyone. So there are two sort of reparations avenues that are currently happening in Evanston. So there is the municipal program that was mentioned before. So that is a commitment by the city of Evanston, a pledge of 10 years, $10 million, funded by tax revenue from legal cannabis to be put into housing and economic development work in the city. In addition, there is also a community group, and that is there's a steering committee of citizens that are partnered with that. Reverend Nabors is a member of that, and Robin has participated. There's a number of folks who have participated and are part of that. There is also a community-led group called the Reparations Stakeholders Authority of Evanston, or the RSAE. So this is a 501c3 nonprofit with a rotating board of Black Evanstonian community members. And the fund is held here at the Evanston Community Foundation. We're holding that fund for no fees to build it and endow it over time so that it can create programming that isn't funded by the city's program. So that could be anything from cash payments, community education, art programming, things that don't fit under the city's program. This program aims to do that. I like to make the distinction because whenever foundations and large institutions get in the mix, the issue of control can come up. We are holding the fund for no fees. We are partners with the RSAE, but those funds are directed 100% by the RSAE and their board and the community members who participate there. But we are, full partners there. So I do want to make sure that folks are aware of that. Also want to remind people, please, I see a few hands up among attendees. Please put your questions in the chat. We'll direct those questions and answer those later on. Looks like we have about 80 people all total in the room. So I'm sure among those 80, there's some questions. So please put them in the chat so that we can, answer your questions. So I want to talk a little bit, again, moving specifically to the work that's happened in Evanston. Some of these questions, as mentioned, Dino Robinson couldn't be here with us tonight, and he's, such a great historian, has really cataloged Black history so diligently in Evanston. But I'm wondering, Robin and Dr. Nabors, if you could share a little bit about, sort of the process for uncovering the harm done in Evanston. As Professor Brooks mentioned earlier, we're focused, on redlining here. The current reparations program has been focused around redlining. So please talk a little bit about the process through which we documented that here in our community and how that led to the passage of the legislation.
Absolutely, Saul. And I'll tell you that it was really our biggest asset, Dino and Shorefront Legacy Center, our biggest asset in accelerating our reparations work, where you see other communities and initiatives taking a year and 18 months and 24 months to study and further develop a harm report. We were able to get from our own Dino an initial report within 15 days that our legal team, led by Corporation Counsel Nick Cummings, could use to begin to craft his legal framework in a viable legislative program for reparations. And so we had I have to say that we had a community process that really informed our priorities for reparations by consensus. So although there is some opposition, we very easily came to consensus on moving forward with housing. And then Dino's report showed the detail, not just the narrative, not what we know from oral history and our lived experiences, but the specific Evanston policies, zoning laws, housing practices, homes being relocated, the specific harms that are responsible for our racial segregation, physical racial segregation today. And so that report was done by Dino and his colleague, Jenny Thompson from the Evanston History Center. You can learn more about it. You can read it. It's in draft form because he's still uncovering every week more harms. And that's going to inform more repair. The more we have evidence, the more we can expand our budget, we can expand our programming and so on. But please do, everyone, take the time to read that report at the City of Evanston's website. In addition to that, I have to really acknowledge some other partners. Institutions and leaders across this nation have really been in support of what we're doing in Evanston. And so we've had support also from the African American Redress Network and other leaders that are been supporting the Evanston Reparations initiative and supporting Dino in his work as well.
And Saul, I would add to that, that Robin is spot on in terms of Dino being, we've always considered Dino to be a sort of, Evanston treasure, but I think after the big payback goes out, he's going to be a national treasure because as Robin said, he was the key individual in being able to research and find the damage that has been done and to show proof of it in such an amazing and incredible way. The damage that was done, the families that were affected, that made the process, whether people agreed with the process or not, it made the process so much easier because there was factual information. And Robin talks about the amazing partners that she's been able to call and develop. So I want to also share that she is the one that is primarily responsible for helping to develop those partnerships that also include at the national level, Howard University's law school, Columbia University. It's important to lift up those institutions of higher education that have really come to the forefront and really partnered with and been advocates for Evanston reparations. Sheila Jackson Lee down in Texas has been an incredible friend and advocate. The Congressional Black Caucus, I mean, everywhere that Robin went, it was like having the Midas touch because people understood the importance of this first reparation movement in Evanston and how it will probably end up becoming an amazing segue to so many others around the country.
Thank you. From there, I'd love to talk a little bit about, after laid the groundwork from the historical perspective, we talk a little bit about what the community engagement and legislative process looked like. Again, sort of for our Evanston colleagues, sort of how we brought the community voices in, waded through all the different voices and perspectives on what the work should look like to come to a solution that was best for the community in this moment.
Awesome. So it was February of 2019 that this discussion began. And it was April of 2019 that it made its first official step through a legislative process. And that was a recommendation to the Equity and Empowerment Commission. I made the recommendation there strategically and didn't use my automatic privilege for, special order of business, but it allowed a process for robust community engagement. And so through multiple meetings, we had community meetings where we asked three simple questions. What would we like to see for reparations for our harms in the Black community? How might we fund it and who should qualify? And there was plenty of participation. There were also virtual meetings and ward meetings and so on. And from there, our Equity and Empowerment Commission crafted a recommendation to our city council. Our city council unanimously embraced the reparations commitment. It went back and later there were priorities that were set based on community feedback, and that's where we landed on housing, economic development, and education initiatives. And then we had to think about, how do we fund it? There were many ideas, but the one that made the most sense immediately to launch our fund was cannabis sales tax, because it was just passing in the state, because of the harm in the war on drugs, because 71% of marijuana arrests in Evanston were Black and we're 16% of the population, and how that harmed us further. It made sense for it to be a tax revenue that would be sustainable, as we know that is a thriving industry. And so through that process, all of our meetings, we know Evanston is very engaged, takes ownership in community matters. All of our committee meetings, council meetings, ward meetings were all public with time for public comment, access to our alder people, our committee people, our commissioners, and so on. And that's how we got to the place in 2019 where we passed the resolution, as well as informing our first remedy, this $25,000 housing benefit. All of that was informed through a public process. And we're excited to know, even though there are some that don't agree with the initial remedy, excited to see that there is more engagement now. And I think the launching of the RSAE is really a response that those that are in opposition have been heard. We are agreeing more needs to be done than housing, economic development, and educational initiatives. And the RSAE, led by Dr. Nabors and Dino, allows for the infrastructure and the funding to do more repair beyond that which the city is committed to.
Thank you so much. Reverend Nabors, I know, in addition to the legislative process, the faith-based community has really stepped up. We actually recently had an event right outside my office here at Fountain Square, where a number of our faith-based organizations, and frankly, many white-led faith-based organizations stepped forth and sort of made their commitment to support this work. So can you talk a little bit about how the faith-based community came into play in all of this, the community at large, but maybe what the role community can play using our faith-based community in Evanston as an example?
Sure, Saul, I'd love to do that. And I'd like to preface my statement by saying that after the screening last week, when Robin introduced me to the group from New York, as a pastor working with the Interfaith group in Evanston, I had probably about 15 or 20 people that came up to me and asked for my card because they wanted to take it back to their pastors and share with their pastors what local churches are doing in the community. So I'm very excited about that. And I also want to say, Robin, that you talked about how Evanston is so open and involves everybody and working with everybody. And it certainly reminded me of, of a Black Baptist church as well. We are open and we involve everybody as a congregational kind of polity, and that's important. Now, Saul, with regard to the interfaith movement in Evanston, there's been a strong group for years. There are a couple of organizations in Evanston that involve clergy, and one of them is Evanston Own It, which is predominantly African American and located in the 5th Ward, where Robin was an alderman. There's another group that's called Evanston Interfaith Clergy and Leaders, and that's a larger group that is focused on relationships beyond denomination and ecumenism. It involves our Jewish synagogues as well. So we had been having dialogue about reparations with them in their monthly meetings ever since Reparations was on the front page in Evanston the last couple of years. But in the last 6 months or so, those houses of worship decided that they needed to do more than to just be sort of verbal advocates for the reparations movement. And they began to challenge each other at their local monthly meetings. Most of these were on Zoom, of course, because we're still in COVID capacity. And so being a part of those meetings actually created an opportunity for them to want to talk to folks from Evanston Own It. So several months ago, we sort of put together a meeting with Evanston Own It, predominantly African-American clergy, and EICL, predominantly white clergy, and they had a chance to hear everybody talk about reparations. Out of that movement and all of that time where they were talking, they decided to have the rally that you mentioned, Saul, that was just a week ago today at Fountain Square, the middle of our city. And that rally was to show solidarity with reparations in Evanston. So there were 16 houses of worship that came together and signed an incredible pledge of support. And they also pledged that they would not only be verbal advocates, but they would be advocates with regard to funding and any other resources that they might be able to provide. On that very day, Saul, you know that there was one house of worship that gave you a $35,000 check, which is just incredible. In the past, we've also had another amazing church. These are predominantly white churches, but the second church gave a $50,000 check. Though it's a white church, it's headed by an amazing African woman. And those checks are coming in because they know about the damage that was done, Saul, and they also know about the need for community engagement. So I want to say that what has really been effective, and I think Robin will certainly agree with this, it's having built relationships with these folks even before reparations. It's having the ability to have other rallies, to have community laments where everybody gathers together. So when that happens, it seems to me that there is this relationship that is built up and a network. So when it came to reparations, they were very, very open. And we believe hundreds of thousands of dollars are going to end up going into probably RSAE because of the effort of the amazing interfaith group in Evanston.
Thank you so much. Yeah, such incredible momentum, and those have been two of the highlights. I'm actually at a year now in my seat at ECF, and those checks related to the RSAE fund are certainly top highlights of my time here, and it's been really exciting community movement all across the community. Dr. Brooks, I'd love you to just kind of put a national perspective to this as we've talked about some of the things that have gone on in Evanston to this point. Just wondering if you could share a little bit from your kind of work in connection with folks doing the work across the country, how you see, learnings that the broader movement has taken from Evanston. What are some things that are happening that look the same or look different, or perhaps even learnings from missteps that may have been made in the process here in Evanston? What have you seen kind of going on that people are drawing from the work being done here?
Sure. So let me just begin by noting that if you were to go to Montgomery, Alabama in the late 50s and ask anyone, what's the state of the public accommodations fight in Montgomery, I think people would be mystified by the question and be in search for an answer. That is to say, on the eve of the Montgomery boycott, which literally transformed the legal and political and moral trajectory of the country. And so with this nascent, burgeoning, birthed recently reparations movement in Evanston, I believe that we are at a point where there's much promise. There is no, I think, realistic standard of perfection to be demanded of anyone. But I'll just note a couple of things. As Robin has lifted up, and I think as the citizens of the city have put forward, the challenge with respect to reparations in this country is that the harms are diverse, and so the remedies must be diverse. So housing, which let me commend, I'm not sure who came up with this, housing was probably the most brilliant way to start. Why? Because housing is the greatest source of intergenerational wealth. It is the most quantifiable asset that most people have, right? So in other words, stocks go up and down, bonds go up and down, housing may go up and down, but it is a quantifiable asset that can be readily measured. And it is the asset that Black people who certainly have been deprived of consistently, both at the hands of the federal government and the private market, and the federal government aiding, federal, state, and municipal government aiding and abetting discrimination in the private sector. So I see in Evanston a kind of wrestling with how do we respond to the diversity of harms, okay? I also see in this effort a wrestling with the challenge of how do we grapple with diversity of funding streams? How do we finance this, right? And this is not unusual, right? And Robert, I don't want to embarrass you, but you have in many ways the Callie D. House problem, right? Remember Callie House started a reparations movement in the early 1900s, right? And which grew to 300,000 members. And what did she do? She said, well, how do we fund reparations? And they looked at the idea of imposing a tax on cotton harvested by slaves. So they were looking for funding mechanisms, right? They didn't say it was marijuana. They said, what was the cash crop at the time? Cotton. And so the challenge becomes for us, how do we look at diverse harms? In a paper I did with my colleague, Professor Linda Billmas, we looked at harms in terms of housing, healthcare, the environment, labor, the criminal justice or criminal legal system. So all of these all these systems produce different harms. The harms may have to be compensated in different ways, which require different funding streams. So that I think part of the challenge here is maybe, and this is not a suggestion, but really a question, how do we bring in more analytic tools to look at different ways to fund what it is that you're endeavoring to do in terms of redressing these harms? The other thing I hear in Evanston is the challenge of who's compensated, right? And I love the research I've read in terms of whom you've identified as ancestors, people who lived in the city for a period of time as a consequence, subject to redlining, subject to housing depreciation, subject to urban renewal, Negro removal back in the day. But there are other ancestors, right? In other words, people who have experienced harms at the hands of the criminal legal system. How do we respond to that? And the intergenerational harms that stem from that. Healthcare. And so what I'm suggesting here is Evanston really is a metaphor for what we have to do as a country. Because the thing that I think you all did brilliantly, but it is a tiny window into the problem, which is you focused on housing and the ways in which the municipal government aided and abetted discrimination. But I, as a federal fair housing attorney, would modestly suggest, right, the federal government, of course, aided and abetted discrimination in terms of FHA loans, VA loans, aided and abetted literally the depreciated value of African-American homes, appraisals, taxes. So the point being is you all took the most accessible part of the problem from a municipal perspective. But you've unwittingly laid down a challenge for the federal government. So I'm delighted that Representative Sheila Jackson Lee and you are working so closely together. Why? Because whether you know it or not, yours is like the Montgomery boycott. It's a challenge to the whole system of public accommodations discrimination. And so I don't have a lot of fancy advice, but I would suggest not so much advice being given to you, but advice that you're rendering and giving to the country in terms of defining those three things we need to do. Diversify the funding streams, diversify the definition of harms, substantiate those harms, empiricize those harms, tabulate those harms, and also give some hard thinking to who's recognized as having been harmed, right? Who's deserving of reparations? That's a tough question.
Thank you so much. I think that just leads to a larger question. I mean, we talked about some of the lessons, but I think kind of looking at what's happened here locally, I'd love to hear really from each of you, just sort of what do you think we got right here with the work, and if we could start all over, right, knowing what we know now. And Dr. Brooks, I know you're not local, but I'd love for you to weigh in on this as well, looking at from what you know of the process. But knowing what we know now, flash forward nearly 3 years later, what would we do differently, or what would you do differently if we could start the process over again? So I've had Reverend Nabors, I feel like you've been stuck in the middle of most of these questions, so I'm gonna let you kick us off this time. How does that sound?
Thank you, Saul. That's fine. So I think that's a great question. And obviously, one of the easiest answers is if we had any power or control over it, we would not have begun this prodigious effort with the start of a global pandemic. Yeah, the global pandemic and COVID was very, very problematic with us initially. And I want to give kudos to Robin and others at City Council that persevered. In light of the COVID, she was determined to continue the conversation about reparations and to make sure that the initiative was going to begin. I think additionally, what I would do is probably make an effort to do even more with regard to communication to the broad spectrum in our community. Not that we would ever have come to a sort of 100% consensus, but to make sure that that the folks who were even in disagreement felt like their opinions were being heard and understood, even though the movement decided to go in a different direction. I think that would be important as well. And I think the third thing that that I would do is, if I had it to do over again, is to really talk about the urgency of the moment. And I think we're looking back now, and again, this started in the early part of 2019. It's now 2022. I think Robin lined everything up so wonderfully in terms of beginning this effort. I just wish that we had an understanding of how urgent the moment is, not just for Blacks in Evanston, but for Black people in the United States. Benjamin E. Mays, who was the president of Morehouse for many years, used to have a saying, I think he said it at the end of every commencement, I only have a minute, only 60 seconds in it. Forced upon me, didn't use it. I must suffer if I lose it, give account if I abuse it. Only a tiny little minute, but eternity is in it. So that urgency, I think, would make a big, big impact if we had to do it over again.
Mm-hmm.
See, both Robin and Dr. Brooks are muted. Whichever one of you want to jump in, I'll let you go.
Professor Brooks, please.
You know, I guess having been a civil rights leader and a litigator, I am almost allergic to Monday morning quarterbacking. So I won't take note of things that might be done differently. I'll simply lift up questions I have. The questions I have in retrospect would be, in making the case for reparations, we have to quantify the harms. We have to say we've been harmed in thus and so ways. This is the racial wealth gap, as you did. And as you did with respect in terms of the city of Evanston, and say Sandy Darity has done with respect to Black people more broadly. One of the things I'd be interested in is looking at a way to assess to what extent are the things that we're doing, the reparatory justice that we're bringing about, to what extent does it address the racial wealth gap? What measures do we have in place to measure that, right? And then in the same way that we look at the racial health gap in terms of lifespans, you know, I would ask, are there ways for us to bake into this reparatory justice effort a way to assess, and I don't mean in a kind of dry academic, wouldn't that make an interesting paper, but seeing to what degree are your efforts, if you will, to bring about 40 acres and a mule to people, to what extent does that put people in a position where they're more self-sustaining, in a better position to have viable communities? So that assessment piece, I think, is key. I would be interested in looking at, and I saw this in the chat, what efforts are being put forward to protect this embryonic movement. So right now, there's a wonderful Tribeca film, right, highlighting your collective leadership and your success. But with heightened attention brings heightened criticism. And as we are all students of history, we know that there's also a heightened sense of vulnerability. There will be lawyers who will be looking for ways to undermine your efforts. There will be policymakers who will look for ways to undermine your efforts. There will be those who will look to weaponize your efforts to make it the grist, if you will, for public debate, for a national campaign against reparations. So thinking even at this stage, what can we do? Yes, in a morally offensive way, but also in a politically defensive way. Those would be some of the kinds of questions that I have. And let me just say, I'm heartened by the fact that, you know, you've engaged Columbia Law School and Howard Law School and so many national networks, because I think that's important analytically and for the substance of the work, but it's also going to be important to protect your work so that you're able to grow. You're able to perfect, not be perfect, but to perfect the effort. Does that resonate?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I would say that I wish a lot of things happened differently, but I think that I'm very satisfied that we had the audacity to move forward in this way, and that we can learn as we go and implement and improve and continue learning and applying, instead of being paralyzed in the who has the best theory and the smartest one and the biggest institution and what's the right way, and be 35 years languishing in Evanston City Council like HR 40 has done. And so I feel very confident in us taking the first step and working to improve it while learning from, important scholars like Professor Brooks. He is another one that I had the great fortune to have a one-on-one conversation with and learn from. I'm flattered he called me colleague. I call him mentor. And I think that we have to continue learning and improving the work, and knowing that it is complex, and that any version of full repair will not happen with anything that we do at a local level. And so once we know that and stand on that 2002 resolution that called for HR 40 to be passed by the city of Evanston, and do the work that we're doing thanks to Saul and engaging Cook County and so on, I think that we continue to add on to the work. What I wish would have happened and what I thought would happen is that we get it to a point of passing, and that institutions locally would engage, namely Northwestern University, with research and other assets that they have, and other institutions that just did not engage. I wish we would have had more engagement early on, but we've done it now, and we have the engagement now, and we can move forward. And I like to just look at how do we move forward.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to commend something which may not be fully appreciated, or at least I hope it's appreciated locally, which is to say, historically speaking, when we look at reparations in the context of, say, Japanese Americans, Native Americans, when we look at reparatory compensation across an array of federal programs, what you see is over and over again small programs that gain momentum and authenticate themselves as they move along. So in other words, you make mistakes, you refine the process, you engage in empirical efforts, quantifying what the problem is, but also narrative efforts in terms of telling the story. And in so doing, you build a sense of momentum. And so your point about not waiting for 30 years, everybody, all 80 people on this call, please hear this, because Martin Luther King said a version of what Robin said when he said, beware of the paralysis of analysis, right? At some point or another, you have to make a decision. At some point or another, I know this is a civil rights lawyer, if they gather the evidence, make a call, and pursue justice, whether it be going to court, passing a bill, or whatever the case may be. So the momentum part of this, I think, is key.
Thank you all. So we have another clip from the big payback that we'd love to roll. So we can roll the redlining clip, and we'll jump into a few more questions.
This is the red line map that shows the area that was redlined, all encompassing the 5th Ward. Redlining was a federal housing program designating areas in cities that had a potential real estate growth and assigning value to areas. So if you're in the higher letters, A, B, the green areas are the most desirable areas. Those are areas where banks specifically would lend money for housing and for development. So this whole blue area here is all lakefront property, so highly desired. Then when you get in yellow, it's kind of iffy, but a lot of times this represents like middle class, working class, ethnic white. If you're labeled D, that's the lowest, banks recommend no investment whatsoever. Not in housing, not in business development. 100% of the time, it is the Black population. So Robin lives about right here, right in the middle where the D2 is.
All right. As the reparations movement has gained momentum across the country, the question of whether reparations are for the descendants of enslaved Africans in America or for all of the African diaspora, and specifically talking about reparations in America. So what are your thoughts on that question, and what merit, what merit do you see to the other side? Dr. Brooks, I'd love for you to kick us off there.
Sure. This is a very nettlesome question because the large majority of people of African descent are the descendants of African slaves who were brought here. And many of those folks, including me, our lineage goes to the ports of Charleston and New Orleans and Richmond and across the South. And so clearly reparations should focus on people of African descent who are the descendants of slaves. But there's an internal conflict here that we need to be aware of, which is to say, if, as Evanston has so brilliantly demonstrated, it's not merely about slavery, but the vestiges and the aftermath and the institution of slavery, the continuation of slaverocracy in the present, in ways that are empirical, in ways that are quantifiable. If that is in fact real, if redlining is a real racial harm, if urban renewal slash, they referred to it back in the day as Negro removal, if that's a real harm, if segregation is a real harm, then the question we have to ask ourselves is if someone who is a descendant or whose forebears come from Nigeria or the Bahamas or Jamaica, and if they've experienced Jim Crow segregation and the devaluing of their homes, the diminishment of their health as a consequence of segregation and discrimination in this country, the question for us is, are we going to leave them without a remedy and leave them not whole? Can we maintain that people who are the descendants of African slaves brought to this country, are we comfortable saying we're going to make them whole, but leave others in a broken state of disrepair, economically speaking? And may I give you two examples? So as president and CEO of the NAACP, I had the privilege of recognizing Sidney Poitier, who's of West Indian ancestry, with the highest award from the NAACP. He was not the descendants of slaves brought to America, but he experienced Jim Crow segregation. He supported the civil rights work of Black people in this country and made this country better. I think of also Harry Belafonte, who was also descendant of West Indian people. I think of the first Black woman in Congress, Shirley Chisholm. And so I'm a little anxious, I'm a little uneasy, I'm uncomfortable with leaving some Black people remediless. As a civil rights leader, that's very, very uncomfortable. And for this reason, it seems unfair, it seems immoral, but even worse, it fundamentally undermines the foundation for reparations. Meaning, if we don't recognize that Jim Crow segregation in Evanston as it affected people who are descendants of continental Africans or West Indians, then the moral foundation for reparations collapses. That's the source of my unease.
Robin?
Yeah, and so I think first of all, my leadership is very hyper-local. And we are a very diverse Black community here in Evanston. And when you think about the initiator of the reparations conversation in Evanston is a Haitian immigrant, Judge Lionel Jean-Baptiste. When you think about our neighbor to the south that is pursuing reparations, Chicago, was founded by a Haitian immigrant. We have a diverse, the whole diaspora was here. And I personally consider myself to be Pan-African. But aside from my personal beliefs, I think that we should inform or determine eligibility based on the harm or the injury. And if everybody Black was harmed because they were discriminated against because of the color of their skin, or they were Black or lived in a Black community, then those harms should inform the eligibility, just like it informs the remedy. And there, I believe that I don't support, I know the lineage argument is one that is robust. I don't support that, especially in Evanston. It really has not come up as a debate. There may be some conversation, but it's not been brought to our committee at all, the lineage discussion. But I think even with the state of California in their incredible 500-page report, it argues the point of non-slavery or post-slavery harms, which would be difficult to exclude those that only, limited it to only those that had American descendants of slaves. So I'd like to see a more expansive approach to eligibility. I also think that it's hyper local, especially with these local initiatives. Every community is different. And I think that in Evanston, we are a diverse Black community. The whole diaspora was here by 1969 when our eligibility is established and descendants. So I think that we should be supporting all of the Black community. I think it is going to be a more complex determination with the Federal Reparations Commission, and that work is left for the commission to do.
Reverend Nabors?
I certainly appreciate the response of my colleagues, and that they are spot on. From my perspective, I have to put my pastoral hat on, and my pastoral hat is definitely one of inclusivity. I truly believe that there is great power in unity. And I think that the worst thing that could possibly happen to Black people, whatever their background or ethnicity in the country, is if we draw lines of division as it relates to reparations. So I think that if we can find a large enough umbrella that helps us to understand that every single Black person with Black skin has experienced some form of discrimination in this country, some damage as a result of the color of their skin, then I think it becomes easier for us to say they too should be recipients of some form of reparations. I think that's really crucial and important. I was always taught, and I think that most people will agree with this, when you are stopped on the street because of you are Black, when you are stopped in a car because you are Black, they do not ask you if you are Belize, they do not ask you if you're Jamaican, they do not ask you if you're West Indian or African American, they stop you because you are Black. And very often, as a result of that being stopped, there is a form of damage that is done. So I think we have to find that avenue that draws us together in terms of unity. And I think we also have to understand, in my humble opinion, that this is not very different from the whole color scheme that divided our people for hundreds of years as well. We cannot be divided because of our ethnicity and our lineage. Our unity lies in the fact that that we are people of color, that we have been blessed and touched and singed by the equatorial sun. And when you think about the local people that Robin just talked about, we have to think about some of those major people. Marcus Garvey led one of the grandest movements that African Americans in this country's ever known, and was born and raised in Jamaica. So we have more in common than we do those things that separate us. And I hope we can figure out how to lock arms and make sure that whatever we're doing in reparations is going to be beneficial for all people out of the African diaspora.
So may I know if we have a brother, sister, sibling, a colleague who takes the opposite view, that reparations should be reserved only for the American descendants of slaves, I would simply say to you, even as we debate, we labor together, right? So, because, If we allow ourselves to disagree to the point that we fail to take action together, I would argue we are dishonoring our forebears, whether they come from Nigeria, West India, from Nigeria, from Jamaica, the West Indies, or my forebears who come from West Africa and Central Africa via the low country of South Carolina. Now, I'm saying this as an American descendant of slaves with the receipts, with the lineage. We will have no problems proving that. But I want to stand in solidarity, even if someone disagrees with my perspective, because I'm not going to dishonor our forebears by debating someone to the degree to which I fail to stand with you.
I think that's an important point, and I do think that we started this conversation off looking at reparations for slavery versus the idea of reparations for all of the harms done to Black folks in America since 1619. And I think depending on how you're viewing the conversation, you might come up with a different answer there, right? If we're talking about reparations specifically for the harm of slavery, then that is very likely a different argument than the reparations for, the totality of the harms done to Black folks in America. And I appreciate that point that coming together in debate and working together, as opposed to letting those divisions be something that stops us from moving forward, Professor Brooks, is an important point to make. We have just one more clip we'd love to roll, the Nick Cummings clip, if we could roll from the Big Payback, and then we'll come back and we'll start to dip our toe into some of the audience questions.
The number one question that I get asked as the legal counsel is, how do you deal with it being a race-based program? How do you get over that hurdle? With respect to reparations or any sort of equity work in this country, ironically, you battle the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection under the laws of all citizens in the United States. Although the amendment was passed to try and benefit freed slaves and African Americans in the country, it's actually been used to deny opportunities to those same groups. If someone sues to say this isn't right, this is reverse discrimination. It's one of my favorite terms. This is reverse discrimination. And ironically, discrimination is one of the hardest things to prove. You can always say the area of housing, this person was denied because of their income. They were denied because of their credit. They were denied because of a laundry list of things that had nothing to do with their race.
So I do want to encourage folks again to continue to put questions in the chat. We've had a few come through. And I do want to make a point of saying that there are a couple of questions that have come through specifically about the status of the City of Evanston's fund. Actually, a question asked of me regarding that. So I want to make clear again, when I talk about the reparations fund at ECF, that is a separate entity. So the one collecting donations is a fund that the Evanston Community Foundation holds, but is controlled by the Reparations Stakeholders Authority of Evanston, which is a 501c3 organization. So it's an agency fund. So those donations that we mentioned are related to that. I do not believe anyone on the call has any specific insight into the status of any of the funds related to the City of Evanston's program. We did not have anyone from any current council members or any legal counsel from the City of Evanston on this call this time around. Certainly is the right of every community member to ask those questions of their local government. Unfortunately, we just do not have the answers there. I'd be happy to, folks have questions about the size of the RSAE fund. Just a little over $260,000. We're building that to $1 million before we start to do work from it. So we'd love for folks to continue to support that effort, but I cannot share the status of any funds related specifically to the City of Evanston and those sort of things. There was some questions that I think are important to ask here about the role of the white community was pointed specifically as an Evanston question, but I'd love to hear from this entire group. What role do white Americans have to play in reparations? What, if any, role? So Reverend Nabors, I'd love to pass that question to you first.
Thanks, Saul. So I will go back to the work that we've been doing with our interfaith community in Evanston. It's a predominantly white community. So I think when you have such a prodigious issue as reparations, you need allies everywhere, and you need allies in every color. You need allies from every perspective to support the cause. So I think that the role of whites is an important one. I have not run into any white person that wants to take the lead in reparations. They are always willing and ready and able to be supportive of the Black leadership in Evanston. But there is not one white person that I know has said, hey, I want to come and I want to be a leader. So I think it's important for them to be able to be an advocate for, number one, to be an advocate for reparations, but number two, also to take the information that they've learned about reparations back to their own concentric circles. Talk with their families, talk with their friends, talk with the folks that they work with about it, talk with members of their congregation about it as well, so that folks are being educated about reparations, and that it's not a revolution. It's not starting World War III. It is repairing damage that has been done that is so necessary. And I think the last piece, of course, white people have to play a major role, because I think it's important for them to contribute to the reparations fund as well. I think that's where the funding has to come from white individuals and organizations and institutions that are run by whites.
Robin?
I can't add anything. Dr. Nabors summed it up.
Yeah.
And I will say, if any white people are on the call and don't know what to do or who to turn to, be in touch with the interfaith community in Evanston and learn from them. I think they're doing an excellent job.
And Professor Brooks?
I would just simply note, from a historical and national perspective, the role of white people with respect to the reparations movement is not unlike the role of Black people in Congress in terms of Japanese Americans. So when Japanese Americans sought reparations, not once, but twice, right after World War II, they received a pittance for the deprivation of lives, liberty during World War II in terms of them being sent to internment camps. Then a few years later, more than a few years later, in the 80s and 90s, Japanese Americans sought real reparations, and they were backed by the Congressional Black Caucus. The Congressional Black Caucus provided a model, if you will, of allyship. The Congressional Black Caucus supported testimony. It supported financial reparations for Japanese Americans, engaging the Justice Department, and H.R. 40 was dropped after that. And so what I want to simply say here is Black people have served as a model of allyship for white people. And so this is about us being, as Americans coming together to recognize the harm. And the last point I'll make here, which I think is key, is before people make a contribution to a fund, they have to start with understanding why the fund was created in the first place. And one of the things that's so important is for white people to educate other white people that these harms are real, right? Like, in other words, when you ask people to read the slave narratives, ask people, as a civil rights lawyer, I can't tell you the pain that you hear in a person's voice when they've been discriminated against in terms of getting a loan. I've heard that voice. It's a sad voice when you have somebody who's qualified and they were kept out of housing, kept out of an apartment, kept out of a neighborhood to send their kids. And so the point being is, white people can serve an educational role in terms of being teachers for other white people, and then being allies at least as good as Black people have been to other groups in the past.
Professor Brooks, I may come back to you with your legal expertise. So a question that I saw was forwarded to me was about potential constitutional legal battles that come about regarding the 14th Amendment but just, and I believe, City of Evanston Legal Counsel addressed this in the brief clip that we showed a few moments ago. So I don't even know if I have a great question in there other than to talk about what that looks like.
But, I think one of our challenges is, as a country, we assume that the mention of race is the same thing as racism. We assume that if you mention race in terms of trying to help people, that is reverse discrimination. Now, here's the thing. I know with Evanston looked at a discrete problem, a discrete set of practices, ways in which Black people were specifically harmed, measurably harmed, quantifiably harmed, and then developed a remedy for that. This is not radical. Civil rights lawyers do it every day. In fact, you do it in other areas of the law. You see that a person has been harmed, you make a connection between the harm and a particular behavior, a particular policy, then you develop a remedy. So the fact that in this particular instance, that we have a discrete group of people who have been harmed and that we've come up with a remedy is not reverse discrimination. I brought lots of cases where I interviewed people, quantified their harms, put their harms in the form of evidence, and I would say the great people of Evanston conducted themselves like a wonderful law firm. You assessed the evidence, you made the case, and you developed a remedy. So this is not an occasion for us to be pitted against one another. It's an occasion for us to come together around the evidence, and the lawyers might call it evidence, but the preachers might also call it a story. Learn the story, learn the history. That brings people together, and it also creates an opportunity for us to heal and to literally make communities and individuals whole. I think this is an important thing to do, and we don't need to be bashful. We don't need to be fearful simply because somebody mentions race, therefore it's racism, therefore reverse discrimination. That's a catchphrase, but that's not any reason for us to be paralyzed.
Thank you. Yeah, a couple more audience questions. One for you, Robin, and then the final one for you, Reverend Nabors. So Robin, I'd love to hear your thoughts about programs or interventions that might, related to the reparations work, that might address other systemic issues, education, healthcare, mental health. How do all of those things fit into the picture of reparations work happening across the country?
Well, our city in 2019 really looks like every other city that we've been going to. And the recommendations in terms of the diversity in recommendations in all industries and sectors and institutions. And so we're seeing now that there are over 100 initiatives for local reparations. There's over actually 400 total if you can include satisfaction acknowledgements, monuments, holidays, and so on. And so we're seeing that reparation movement is in full momentum. It is happening. It is, we have not reached full repair. We're not even close, but we're seeing various forms of repair. Evanston starting with housing, other communities looking at housing too, but from a different perspective. Detroit, Michigan, initially looking at over-assessed property taxes, and other communities looking at to prioritize education. And so we're seeing that localities are doing what they can within their purview, based on consensus, while we all wait for Congress or President Biden to sign into executive order some version of a federal reparations policy. And I think that that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the momentum of the local actions, building momentum and support for HR 40 now having more co-sponsors than ever, 218 yes votes in the House, a Senate companion bill, and so on. We're seeing more and more institutions like Professor Brooks' institution, Harvard, and its recent report and commitment of an initial 100, and I'm hoping that's an initial $100 million.
Initial. I'm hoping that too.
Okay. Yes. So we're seeing that reparations is playing out in many forms, and all of it is working together towards more hope and an opportunity for a federal initiative.
Thank you. And then Reverend Nabors, this is our closing audience question. This is, I think, one that could be complicated, so I'll allow other folks to tag in if they have thoughts. But think with the as a sort of one of the founding members of the RSAE here in Evanston, wondering how we draw the distinction between what's reparations and what's charity or philanthropic giving. Like what does that look like in the context of the Reparations Stakeholder Authority of Evanston?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, Saul. And I would say, first of all, the work that we've done to create RSAE has a powerful mission statement with goals and objectives and information that is readily available for anybody that is interested in learning about us. So when we think about the actual mission statement, it is not it's not asking for charity. It's not a charity organization. It is an organization that was developed specifically to address issues of damage that was done because of racism. So with regard to that repair that we've been talking about all evening, RSAE is dedicated to receiving funds and resources and assistance to handle that kind of damage that has been done. And the folks who are a part of the board and who are, and Dino is the president of that. I serve as the treasurer of that as well. And for yourself from your role with ECF, that any funding that is coming in is not coming in so that we can just dole it out to people as a sort of charitable contribution, but it is identifying particular issues that our people in Evanston have faced where they have been damaged because of their race. And it is then when the opportunity arises, when we hit that $1 million mark, we'll be able to give that money out to folks in areas where they've been greatly damaged. So I think it's important to understand that a lot of people say that reparations is charity. Right? I've heard that before from a lot of folks, but it is not charity. For those people who make that argument, and it's a historical argument, it goes back a long, long ways. For those people who make that argument, what they do is they sort of just surface over the deeper level of damage that has been done against Black people, not just during slavery, but during our 400 years here in the United States. So we are dealing with that issue, and it is not charity. It is definitely reparations. So I would answer it in that way.
Well, looking at the time here, I think there's worse things you can do than have a preacher close us out with final remarks. So just want to make a couple of notes. First of all, I want to thank everyone for your participation, for your questions. I know there were some folks from our community who joined. I want you to feel free to send us notes or some audience questions we couldn't get to. Please feel free to send a note. You can send it to the Evanston Community Foundation at info@evanstonforever.org if you have more questions about the RSAE fund or the work that we're doing as a grant-making organization in that regard. Also want to let folks know that this has been recorded and will be broadcast. We'll be sharing the link out, and all of the resources and links that were dropped in the chat from WTTW will be made available with that mailing. But I want to thank all of our wonderful panelists for their candor and their time this evening. I want to thank all of the audience for joining us and for your attention and your important questions. And I want to thank WTTW for creating this opportunity for us to have this conversation. And we're so grateful for this time. And with that, I will call Tim Russell back to the screen to close us out.
What a great conversation. And thank you, Saul, for moderating the conversation. And what we learned, and what I learned in particular, is that the issue of reparations is very complex. It's not just a one-size-fits-all, and I appreciate that from this conversation. Thank you, Robin, Reverend Nabors, and Dr. Brooks for your insight. Again, thank you to the Evanston Community Foundation and the Reparations Authority of Evanston for your partnership. Please visit WTTW.com/firsthand to explore all seasons of Firsthand, in which we looked at gun violence, coronavirus, poverty, and now segregation through the eyes of Chicagoans. Finally, please visit WTTW.com/events or WFMT.com/events for upcoming events. Once again, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you to our moderator and our panelists. And until next time, take care and enjoy the summer.